A rich CEO pretends to be asleep while leaving his safe full of money wide open. When his maid's little boy walks in, what the child does shocks him more than anything he's ever seen. Thomas Whitaker, a man whose name had become synonymous with power and success, sat motionless in his grand leather armchair. His breathing was steady, his eyes closed just enough to feign slumber, though in truth every sense was alert. The room around him was drenched in quiet opulence, oak-paneled, walls lined with shelves of first-edition books, oil paintings worth more than some estates, and at the center, an open safe glimmering with a fortune in neatly stacked bills and glittering jewels. It was the sort of wealth that few could imagine and fewer still could resist. But tonight, this display of abundance was not an accident. It was a test. Thomas had built his empire through decades of discipline and ruthless efficiency. He had weathered betrayals, outmaneuvered rivals, and endured the crushing solitude of a man who trusted no one. Just weeks ago, he had discovered that his closest business partner had siphoned millions from their company. The sting of that betrayal still burned in his chest, and for the first time in years, he questioned whether honesty existed at all in the world he inhabited. It was this growing suspicion that birthed tonight's cruel experiment, leaving temptation in plain sight, to see if a single soul could resist. The timing was precise. As the clock neared 9, the door opened and Diana, his longtime maid, entered quietly with her son by her side. The boy, Daniel, only 7 years old, had often accompanied his mother during night shifts. It was not ideal, but Diana could not afford childcare, and Thomas had never objected to the boy's presence. In truth, he barely noticed them until tonight. Diana moved with quiet determination, her figure tired from years of unrelenting labor, yet her movements carried dignity. She went about her tasks in silence, dusting shelves, wiping glass surfaces, polishing the marble table. Meanwhile, Daniel wandered slowly, curiosity guiding his small steps. His eyes, wide with innocence, soon landed on the sight Thomas had left so deliberately exposed: stacks of money, shining watches, gold coins, and crisp bonds waiting within the gaping mouth of the safe. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. The boy stared at the fortune as though he were looking into another world. His small frame stiffened, his gaze fixed on the dazzling chaos of riches, more wealth than he could ever imagine. Thomas, pretending to sleep, prepared himself for the inevitable, the small hand reaching out, the temptation too heavy for a child to resist. His chest tightened, already bracing for the bitter confirmation that no one could withstand the lure of money, not even an innocent child. But what happened next unsettled him in a way he could never have expected. Daniel did not reach out to steal or even touch. Instead, he frowned slightly, as though disturbed by the disorder in front of him. With careful steps, he approached the safe, and with the reverence of one handling something fragile, he began rearranging the stacks of bills. His movements were slow and precise, his little fingers separating denominations, aligning the piles and straightening the rows. He worked as though he were tidying coins at home, treating the fortune not as treasure, but as a mess that needed order. Thomas's eyes twitched beneath half-shut lids. The boy's behavior was so startlingly simple, yet it pierced through the armor of cynicism he had built for decades. Here was a child who had likely never held more than a few dollars at once, treating a vast fortune not as temptation, but as something belonging to someone else, something to respect. When Diana noticed, she quickly pulled her son back, visibly panicked. But Daniel simply whispered that he had tidied the money so the sleeping boss would be happy when he woke. Thomas felt something shift deep inside him, a sensation so unfamiliar that it unsettled him more than betrayal ever had. For years he had believed that wealth revealed the true nature of people: greed, envy, dishonesty. Yet here, before his eyes, was proof of something different. A boy with nothing had shown greater integrity than men who lived in mansions and wore $1,000 suits. In the days that followed, Thomas could not rid his mind of what he had witnessed. He found himself observing Diana and Daniel more closely, always discreet, but with a growing fascination. He discovered truths that humbled him. Diana's grueling schedule of back-to-back jobs, her refusal to take charity, her insistence on raising her son with dignity despite poverty. He noticed how Daniel always carried a small notebook for homework, how he studied in corners of hallways while his mother scrubbed floors. And above all, he saw the lessons Diana instilled in him: to return what was not his, to work hard, and to measure worth not by possessions, but by honesty. The memory of the boy rearranging the stacks of money stayed with Thomas like an echo he could not silence. For the first time in years, he felt his world tilt, not from the treachery of others, but from the quiet power of integrity where he least expected it. Yet in the shadows of his company, not everyone shared his awakening. There were those who saw Diana's presence and her son's as an intrusion, a reminder of boundaries they believed should never be crossed. Among them was Richard Hale, Thomas's vice president, a man born into privilege, who considered the world his by birthright. Unlike Thomas, Richard viewed Diana and her son not as people, but as intrusions into spaces they did not belong. It was only a matter of time before this prejudice collided with the fragile shift taking place in Thomas's heart. The test had revealed more than honesty. It had awakened something Thomas could no longer ignore. And as Richard's growing disdain turned into dangerous schemes, Thomas would soon find himself forced to choose not as a businessman, but as a man confronted with the true weight of justice. The empire he had built would become a battlefield, not for money but for dignity. And the boy, who had once rearranged a fortune with innocent hands, would become the spark for a reckoning Thomas never saw coming. The following weeks brought tension that hung invisibly over the corridors of Whitaker Enterprises. While Thomas observed quietly, Richard Hale's contempt grew sharper, disguised under polished words and false courtesies. Richard had always been skilled at masking his prejudices beneath professional authority, but behind closed doors his disdain spilled freely. To him, Diana was a servant who had been given too much visibility, and her child was a distraction that disrupted the image of corporate order. The thought that Thomas, the untouchable CEO, might see value in them filled him with resentment. Thomas, however, had already begun to change. The image of Daniel's small hands tidying the piles of wealth remained etched into his conscience. It was not simply the act itself, but the meaning it carried. That integrity could thrive even where nothing was given. That dignity could exist in the humblest of lives. He found himself replaying the scene at night, recognizing that a child had revealed more about human worth than decades of corporate conquests ever had. The more Richard attempted to undermine Diana, the more Thomas's silent resolve grew. Richard's tactics shifted from whispers to actions. He began fabricating reports about Diana's performance, claiming lateness where there was none, and exaggerating minor mistakes into supposed violations. He pressed the Human Resources Department to consider her unfit, and in private conversations, he sneered that certain people should know their place. It was the same tired prejudice passed down through generations of entitlement, but now it had found a target in Diana. What Richard did not know was that every step he took was being watched, documented and preserved. Thomas, unwilling to confront him prematurely, allowed the vice president's arrogance to tighten its own noose. Cameras recorded his staged accusations, microphones captured his veiled threats, and every interaction became another piece of a puzzle that would soon expose him. The breaking point came on a night when Richard set a trap. He arranged for an expensive item to be hidden among Diana's cleaning supplies, intending to frame her for theft. The plan was simple: summon security, accuse her publicly, and ensure her immediate dismissal. For Richard, it would prove his superiority. For Diana, it could have destroyed years of honest labor. Richard Hale's downfall was swift. His arrogance, once protected by family privilege, collapsed overnight. The board that had long tolerated him finally turned away, stripping him of his title and freezing his assets. His polished image shattered, and his name became a cautionary tale instead of a legacy. For Diana, it was a moment of relief and disbelief. Years of quiet endurance had taught her to expect survival, not justice. Yet now, the same walls that once ignored her bore witness to her vindication. She stood steady, dignity intact, shielding her son from the storm. Thomas Whitaker knew this was more than a lesson. It was a calling. His empire could no longer be just about wealth. It had to stand for change. He promoted Diana into a respected role, gave her resources she had long been denied, and created a scholarship for Daniel, honoring integrity over greed. The story spread far beyond the company. What began as a boy's innocent act of tidying, money instead of taking it, became a symbol of honesty that inspired others. Diana and Daniel's story proved that dignity could outshine wealth, and justice could transform even the coldest institutions. Richard faded into obscurity, stripped of power and haunted by his own arrogance. Meanwhile, Whitaker Enterprises became known not just for profit, but for fairness. Awards filled its lobby, but the true victory was in lives uplifted. Daniel grew into a young man with ambition, shaped by his mother's strength and Thomas's belief in him. For Thomas, true wealth was no longer gold or safes. It was measured in trust, in lives transformed, and in the quiet truth that the greatest tests are not of money or power, but of humanity itself. If this story inspired you, please like, share, and subscribe to Spoken Walls for more powerful, life-changing stories. Tell us in the comments, what does honesty mean to you?